The rain hammered down like bullets against the dense canopy of Guadalcanal. August 1942. The jungle was alive, not with birdsong, but with death. Somewhere in the tangled vines and volcanic mud, a young American Marine crouched behind a rotting log, his hands trembling as he gripped a weapon that, just months earlier, his own instructors had dismissed as inadequate. "It won't stop a determined enemy," they'd said back at Camp Pendleton. Too light, too weak, a pea shooter. But now, as Japanese soldiers emerged like ghosts from the tree line, bayonets fixed, eyes burning with imperial fury, that same Marine raised his M1 Carbine and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The sharp crack of .30 caliber rounds split the humid air. Bodies dropped. The weapon that armchair generals had ridiculed as a toy gun had just saved his life. This is the story of how one of World War II's most controversial firearms went from being the joke of the Ordnance Department to becoming the lifeline of American forces fighting in the most brutal theater of the war. It's a story of innovation born from necessity, of skepticism shattered by survival, and of young men who learned that in the suffocating hell of Pacific combat, the best weapon isn't always the biggest. It's the one you can actually carry, aim, and fire when your life depends on it. Before we can understand why the M1 Carbine became so controversial, we need to understand the problem it was designed to solve, a problem that, for decades, the U.S. military had simply chosen to ignore. By 1938, the American armed forces were in a state of mechanical transition. The venerable Springfield Model 1903 bolt-action rifle had served with distinction through World War I, but it was heavy, cumbersome, and increasingly outdated. The semi-automatic M1 Garand was being introduced to replace it, a magnificent weapon that would prove itself again and again across 2 oceans. General George S. Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But there was a catch. The M1 Garand weighed 9.5 pounds empty. Load it with ammunition, add a bayonet, and you're looking at nearly 12 pounds of steel and wood. For a frontline infantryman humping through the hedgerows of France, that was manageable. For a tank crew member, a radio operator, a combat engineer, a mortar team member, an artillery observer, or a second lieutenant trying to read a map while calling in coordinates, it was a nightmare. These soldiers, often called second-line troops, needed personal protection, but they also needed to carry specialized equipment. A radio operator might be hauling a 30-pound SCR 300 radio set on his back. A mortar crewman was responsible for the weapon's base plate and ammunition. These men couldn't effectively carry a full-sized battle rifle along with their primary equipment, yet they couldn't go into combat unarmed. The standard solution had been to issue them pistols, primarily the M1911, a 1.45 automatic. The M1911 was a fine weapon, legendary in its stopping power and reliability. But here's the problem. Hitting a moving target with a handgun beyond 25 yards requires considerable skill. Under combat stress, with adrenaline flooding your system and enemy fire incoming, that difficulty multiplies exponentially. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department recognized this gap, but for years, they did nothing substantial about it. The thinking was traditional, bureaucratic, and dangerously out of touch with modern warfare's realities. If you need firepower, carry a rifle. If you can't carry a rifle, make do with a pistol. End of discussion. But one man refused to accept that answer. Major René Studler of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department was a pragmatist who understood that the nature of warfare was changing. He'd studied the lessons of World War I, where trench raids and close-quarters combat had proven the value of compact, rapid-fire weapons. He'd watched the rise of submachine guns in European arsenals. And he'd listened, really listened, to the complaints coming from field officers who understood that modern combined arms warfare required specialized weapons for specialized roles. In 1938, Studler drafted a requirement for what he called a light rifle, something between a pistol and a full-sized rifle in both size and power. It needed to be light enough to carry alongside other equipment, accurate enough to hit targets at 200 yards, powerful enough to incapacitate an enemy soldier, and simple enough to manufacture in wartime quantities. The response from the military establishment was lukewarm at best, dismissive at worst. Some officers called it unnecessary. Others called it impossible. A few called it both. But then Germany invaded Poland. France fell. Britain stood alone. And suddenly, America's military brass began to realize that the United States was going to war, whether they were ready or not. The formal requirement was issued in October 1940. The specifications were precise: a semi-automatic rifle weighing no more than 5 pounds, capable of semi-automatic fire, effective to 300 yards, fed from a detachable magazine, and chambered for a new cartridge that fell somewhere between pistol and rifle power. Gun manufacturers across America scrambled to submit designs. Winchester Repeating Arms Company assigned the project to their chief engineer, a brilliant designer named David Marshall Williams, a man with a troubled past and an extraordinary talent for firearms innovation. Williams, who went by Carbine as a nickname due to his early work with shortened rifles, had learned his trade under unusual circumstances. In his youth, he'd been convicted of second-degree murder following a raid on an illegal moonshine still in North Carolina. While serving time in Caledonia State Prison Farm, he'd impressed the warden with his mechanical aptitude and was given access to a workshop where he spent years developing firearms mechanisms that would later revolutionize American military weapons. Working with Winchester's design team, Williams developed a short-stroke gas piston system that was remarkably simple and reliable. The weapon that emerged from Winchester's Connecticut factory was unlike anything the military had seen before. The M1 Carbine measured just 35.6 inches long, more than a foot shorter than the M1 Garand. It weighed 5.2 pounds unloaded, less than half the Garand's weight. It fired a newly developed .30 caliber cartridge, the .30 carbine round, from a 15-round detachable box magazine. It was handy, fast-handling, and intuitively pointable. The Army tested it against competing designs from other manufacturers. The Winchester entry outperformed them all in reliability, accuracy, and ease of production. On September 30th, 1941, the U.S. Army formally adopted it as the United States Carbine, caliber .30 M1. But adoption and acceptance are two very different things. Almost immediately, controversy erupted. The .30 carbine cartridge, while more powerful than any pistol round, generated less than half the energy of the standard .30-06 rifle cartridge used in the Garand and Springfield. Ballistics experts pointed out that it lacked the penetration and range of a full-power rifle round. They questioned whether it could reliably stop an enemy soldier, particularly one wearing heavy winter clothing or driven by fanatical determination. Critics in the Ordnance Department and among field-grade officers were merciless. They called it underpowered. They called it a compromise weapon that compromised too much. Some derisively referred to it as a toy gun or a pea shooter. There were serious discussions about canceling the program entirely. But then came December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. America was at war on two fronts, and the military needed weapons, immediately and in massive quantities. Whatever doubts existed about the M1 Carbine, there was no time to develop alternatives. Production ramped up at a staggering pace. By the end of the war, over 6 million M1 carbines would be manufactured by 10 different companies, making it one of the most produced American weapons in history. The carbines began flowing to training camps, then to units deploying overseas. And that's when the real test began, not on firing ranges in Kentucky, but in the jungles, mountains, and islands where American soldiers would face enemies who had no interest in ballistics tables or ordnance specifications. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The name would become synonymous with suffering. The first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War was meant to seize Henderson Field, a strategic airstrip on this miserable island in the Solomon Chain. What followed was 6 months of savage fighting that would test everything American forces thought they knew about jungle warfare. The Marines who splashed ashore on those volcanic beaches carried a mix of weapons. Frontline riflemen had M1 Garands and Springfield 1903s. Some squads had Browning automatic rifles. Officers carried M1911 pistols. And scattered throughout the units were the new M1 carbines, issued primarily to radio operators, mortar crews, and junior officers. The men who carried those carbines had heard the rumors. They'd listened to the dismissive comments from senior NCOs who didn't trust the new weapon. Some felt like they'd been given second-rate equipment, while others got real rifles. That perception changed quickly. The fighting on Guadalcanal wasn't like the warfare of the previous generation. This wasn't the Western Front's open killing fields. The jungle was a claustrophobic nightmare of triple canopy vegetation where visibility often extended no more than 20 yards. Combat happened suddenly, at close range, with little warning. In these conditions, the M1 Carbine's supposed weaknesses became surprising strengths. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to U.S. Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II and Vietnam War truths back to life. The weapon's lightweight meant it could be brought to bear instantly when Japanese soldiers appeared without warning from the undergrowth. Its compact size made it easier to maneuver through dense vegetation where a full-length rifle would snag on vines and branches. The 15-round magazine meant Marines didn't need to reload as frequently during sudden, violent engagements. And the .30 carbine round, while less powerful than the .30-06, proved entirely adequate for the close-range fighting that dominated jungle combat. One particular incident became legendary among the Marines on Guadalcanal. A radio operator named Corporal James Mitchell was part of a patrol that was ambushed near the Matanica River. The patrol's point man went down in the first burst of Japanese fire. The jungle erupted in chaos, screaming, shooting, the crack of bullets through palm fronds. Mitchell dropped his radio, brought up his M1 Carbine, and began firing at muzzle flashes in the vegetation. The carbine's light recoil allowed him to maintain rapid, accurate fire. He emptied one magazine, reloaded in seconds, and continued shooting. When the firefight ended 3 minutes later, 5 Japanese soldiers lay dead. 4 of them confirmed kills from Mitchell's carbine. Back at the unit's position, his platoon sergeant examined the weapon with new respect. "Maybe this thing ain't a toy after all," he muttered. Stories like Mitchell's multiplied across the Pacific theater. Paratroopers loved the carbine because it could be carried with a folding stock variant during jumps. Tank crews appreciated being able to defend themselves without trying to wield a full-sized rifle in the confined spaces around their vehicles. Company commanders found they could carry maps, binoculars, and radios without being weighed down by a 9-pound Garand. But it wasn't just about weight and convenience. The M1 Carbine was proving itself in the crucible of combat because it was designed for the actual conditions of modern warfare, not for the idealized scenarios imagined by peacetime planners. Despite mounting evidence from the Pacific, the M1 Carbine continued to face skepticism, particularly from officers and analysts who hadn't experienced jungle warfare firsthand. The criticism centered on several recurring themes. First, there were persistent reports that the .30 carbine round lacked stopping power. Some soldiers reported shooting enemy troops multiple times without immediately incapacitating them. These accounts were particularly common when fighting Japanese soldiers hopped up on amphetamines or driven by the fanatical Bushido warrior code that demanded they fight to the death rather than surrender. Second, accuracy beyond 200 yards was questionable. The carbine's short barrel and relatively low-powered cartridge meant bullet drop became significant at longer ranges. In open terrain, like the fields of Western Europe or the deserts of North Africa, this was a legitimate limitation. Third, the carbine's reliability was sometimes questioned. Early production models had occasional feeding problems, particularly when magazines were damaged or when dirt and debris got into the action. In the notoriously filthy conditions of jungle warfare, weapons maintenance was challenging, and any malfunction could be fatal. These criticisms weren't entirely unfair. The M1 Carbine was never intended to replace the M1 Garand as a primary infantry weapon. It was designed for a specific niche, providing better-than-pistol firepower for soldiers whose primary duties didn't involve frontline combat. But here's what the critics missed. Warfare doesn't care about your intentions or your doctrine. In actual combat, soldiers use whatever weapons are available and whatever works to keep them alive. As American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the M1 Carbine proved itself again and again in the environment it was best suited for. Close range, sudden engagements in complex terrain where weight, handling, and rapid fire mattered more than maximum range and stopping power. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, one of the most decorated Marines in American history, observed his men in combat, and made a simple calculation. Soldiers who could carry their weapons comfortably all day were more alert, less fatigued, and more likely to have their weapons ready when contact occurred. The carbine's light weight meant his officers and specialists could stay effective throughout long patrols in brutal heat and humidity. By 1944, demand for the M1 Carbine had become so intense that production couldn't keep pace. Units in the Pacific specifically requested more carbines. Paratroopers demanded the folding stock M1A1 variant. Even some frontline infantrymen began requesting carbines, particularly for point men and scouts who valued maneuverability over maximum firepower. The weapon that critics had mocked as inadequate had become one of the most sought-after firearms in the American arsenal. The transformation was remarkable. What began as a controversial compromise weapon had evolved into something approaching iconic status among the soldiers who actually used it in combat. Part of this transformation came from tactical adaptations. Soldiers learned the carbine's strengths and limitations. They discovered that while it might not drop an enemy with one shot at 100 yards, rapid semi-automatic fire could deliver multiple hits quickly, a devastating capability in close quarters. They learned that the weapon's light recoil made it exceptionally controllable, allowing accurate follow-up shots that compensated for the cartridge's lower power. The Marines developed tactics specifically built around mixed weapons. A rifle squad might have 8 men with M1 Garands for long-range firepower, 1 man with a Browning automatic rifle for suppressive fire, and 2 or 3 men with M1 carbines for close-in work when moving through dense vegetation or clearing bunkers. In the Philippines campaign, Army units fighting in mountainous jungle terrain found the carbine ideal for the exhausting climbs and sudden ambushes that characterized that brutal campaign. General Douglas MacArthur's forces engaged in savage close-quarters combat as they pried Japanese defenders from fortified positions. In these fights, the carbine's compact size allowed soldiers to navigate through destroyed buildings and dense undergrowth where longer rifles would have been cumbersome. One Army sergeant, interviewed after the liberation of Manila, put it bluntly, "I started this war thinking the carbine was junk. I'm ending it thinking it saved my life at least 3 times. It's not the rifle I'd want for shooting Germans across a French field. But in this jungle hell, give me the carbine every time." The most dramatic vindication came during the Battle of Okinawa, the last and bloodiest major battle of the Pacific War. Okinawa was a nightmare of mud, artillery, and fanatical Japanese resistance. The fighting lasted 82 days and cost over 12,000 American lives. In the warren of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions that honeycombed the island, the M1 Carbine proved invaluable. Flamethrower operators and demolition teams, who already carried heavy equipment, relied on carbines for self-defense. The weapon's compact size made it practical for fighting in the confined spaces of Japanese cave complexes. Its semi-automatic fire gave soldiers a critical advantage when clearing fortifications room by room, tunnel by tunnel. By the time the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war in the Pacific, the M1 Carbine had fired millions of rounds in combat. It had been carried by Marines storming beaches, paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines, officers leading assaults, and specialists keeping American forces supplied and connected across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The weapon that had been dismissed as a toy had proven itself where it mattered most, not in ordnance board meetings or firing range tests, but in the hands of young Americans fighting for their lives in the most hostile environments on Earth. The M1 Carbine service didn't end with World War II. It would go on to serve in Korea, where cold weather exposed some reliability issues, but where its light weight remained valuable in mountainous terrain. It would appear in Vietnam, often issued to South Vietnamese forces. It would be used by police departments, sold as surplus to civilian shooters, and modified into countless variants. More than 6 million were produced during World War II alone, 1 for every 3 American service members who served. It was issued to every branch of service and nearly every type of unit. For many soldiers, it was the weapon they carried for the duration of their service. But the carbine's real legacy isn't measured in production numbers or service life. It's measured in lives saved and missions accomplished by soldiers who had the right tool for their specific job. The story of the M1 Carbine teaches us several crucial lessons about military procurement, doctrine, and the difference between theoretical planning and battlefield reality. First, it reminds us that specialized weapons for specialized roles aren't compromises, they're necessities. Not every soldier is a frontline infantryman, and pretending otherwise creates dangerous gaps in combat effectiveness. Second, it demonstrates that expert opinion and institutional knowledge aren't always correct. The officers who dismissed the carbine as inadequate were working from doctrine developed in previous wars. They hadn't imagined the close-quarters savagery of Pacific jungle fighting, where engagement distances were measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Third, it shows us the importance of listening to soldiers in combat. The men who actually carried the M1 Carbine under fire understood its value long before the bureaucrats and armchair generals came around. Their feedback and adaptation created tactics that maximized the weapon's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. The greatest irony is that the weapon designed for second-line troops became a first choice for many frontline soldiers in specific environments. The carbine nobody wanted became the carbine everyone requested. Those young Marines crouching in Guadalcanal's mud, those paratroopers floating down over Pacific islands, those radio operators hauling their equipment through Philippine jungles. They didn't care about ballistics charts or ordnance board debates. They cared about survival, and the M1 Carbine helped them survive. There's a photograph, black and white and faded now, taken somewhere in the Pacific in 1945. It shows a young Marine, maybe 19 years old, sitting on a beach with his helmet off and his M1 Carbine across his knees. He's looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has seen too much and lived through what shouldn't have been survivable. In his hands, he holds the weapon that critics called inadequate, that skeptics dismissed as a toy, that traditionalists insisted would fail when tested in combat. That Marine made it home. So did hundreds of thousands of others who carried that same weapon through the deadliest conflict in human history. They mocked the M1 Carbine as a toy. Then Pacific jungles proved it deadly, not because it was the most powerful weapon or the longest ranged or the hardest hitting, but because it was the right weapon, carried by the right people, in the right places, at the right time in history. And that made all the difference. The story of the M1 Carbine isn't just about a firearm. It's about innovation in the face of skepticism, adaptation under pressure, and the courage of young Americans who turned inadequate tools into instruments of victory. It's about the difference between what looks good on paper and what works when lives are on the line. If you found this story compelling, there are countless more waiting to be told. The forgotten battles, the overlooked weapons, the unsung heroes of World War II and beyond. These stories deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to US Last Stand for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world. Share this video with anyone who appreciates military history. And never forget that behind every weapon, every battle, every victory, there were real people, just like us, doing their best in impossible circumstances. Thank you for watching. Remember their sacrifice, honor their service, and keep their stories alive.